The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the hegemony's invasion of Earth came not through military channels but through a routine linguistic analysis report that crossed my desk on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning. The document, transmitted from the forward reconnaissance vessel Dominion's Edge, contained a single line that would forever alter our understanding of humanity's place in the galactic community. The humans are speaking the predecessor's tongue, and they don't even know it. To understand the magnitude of this revelation, one must first comprehend the nature of the ancient tongue itself. For over 10 millennia, the galactic hegemony had ruled through technological superiority and the careful suppression of archaeological evidence. The ruins scattered across 1,000 worlds, the mysterious artifacts that defied analysis, the whispered legends of the predecessors who had supposedly seeded the galaxy with life, all of this was dismissed as primitive mythology, unworthy of serious academic consideration. Yet certain facts could not be entirely suppressed. Deep beneath the surface of Kepler 442b, the hegemony's archaeologists had discovered what appeared to be a vast library, its crystalline matrices containing information in a language so complex, so mathematically precise, that even their most advanced translation algorithms could make no sense of it. Similar discoveries on other worlds painted a picture of a civilization that had achieved technological heights that made even the hegemony's accomplishments seem primitive by comparison. The language itself was more than mere communication. It was a form of reality manipulation. The few fragments that had been successfully decoded revealed concepts for which no modern language had adequate terms. Words that could describe the curvature of space-time as easily as the color of a sunset. Grammatical structures that incorporated quantum uncertainty as a fundamental aspect of meaning. Syntax that could compress the equivalent of entire scientific treatises into single compound expressions. Most disturbing of all, the ancient tongue appeared to have been designed not just for communication between beings, but as an interface between consciousness and the fundamental forces of the universe itself. The hegemony's greatest scholars had spent centuries attempting to unlock its secrets, only to conclude that the cognitive architecture necessary to truly comprehend the language was beyond the capacity of any known species, which made the report from Dominion's Edge all the more impossible to believe. Commander Zeph Hay had been leading the initial survey of the third planet in what the natives called the Sol System. It was meant to be a routine operation, identify strategic resources, catalog potential resistance, establish preliminary occupation protocols. Earth's inhabitants had not yet achieved faster-than-light travel, making them little more than an archaeological curiosity in the grand scheme of galactic politics. The first anomaly occurred during the standard linguistic sampling. Hegemony protocol required the collection and analysis of native communication patterns to facilitate the eventual integration of new species into the Empire's hierarchical structure. What the analysis revealed defied every assumption about primitive civilizations. We initially dismissed it as equipment malfunction, Zeph Hay's report continued. The translation matrices were returning results that suggested the human languages contained embedded structures matching predecessor syntax patterns, not derived from or influenced by actual structural matches. We ran the analysis 17 times using different sample populations across the planet's surface. The results were consistent. The implications were staggering. If humans were somehow connected to the predecessors, it meant that everything the hegemony understood about galactic history was fundamentally incorrect. More than that, it suggested that humanity possessed capabilities that had been hidden not just from the galaxy at large, but from themselves. The investigation that followed would consume the next 3 months and involve some of the hegemony's most brilliant xenolinguistic specialists. What they discovered would not only doom the invasion of Earth, but ultimately lead to the complete restructuring of galactic civilization. Dr. Keth Morin, the hegemony's foremost expert on predecessor artifacts, was the first to recognize the true significance of the human linguistic structures. While serving aboard the research vessel Infinite Recursion, she had spent decades analyzing the crystalline matrices found in the Kepler ruins. Her expertise in pattern recognition within seemingly chaotic datasets made her the natural choice to lead the expanded investigation. The human languages aren't simply related to the ancient tongue, her preliminary findings stated. They are degraded variants of it. What we're seeing is linguistic evolution over an extraordinary time span, possibly tens of thousands of years. The original complexity has been simplified through natural selection pressures, but the underlying architecture remains intact. To test this hypothesis, Keth Moran's team selected a diverse sample of human subjects from different geographic regions and linguistic backgrounds. Using standard hegemony neural interface technology, they were able to monitor brain activity while the subjects engaged in various forms of communication. The results were unlike anything in the scientific literature. When humans spoke their native languages, certain regions of their brains showed activation patterns that matched theoretical models of how a consciousness might process ancient tongue structures. More remarkably, when presented with simplified predecessor text fragments, mathematical concepts and basic logical constructs stripped of their more complex elements, many subjects showed immediate recognition responses despite having no formal exposure to the material. It's as if the capacity is dormant, Kethmorin noted. Like a complex piece of machinery that's been running on reduced power for so long that its operators have forgotten its true purpose. The breakthrough came when the research team decided to attempt direct linguistic instruction. Rather than trying to teach humans to read the ancient tongue, they would instead help them remember it. The subject selected was Dr. Marcus Chen, a computational linguist from Earth's Stanford University who had been taken during one of the preliminary abduction sweeps. Chen's academic background made him an ideal candidate. His mind was already trained in pattern recognition and linguistic analysis, potentially making him more receptive to the awakening process. The first session was conducted with extreme caution. Using carefully modulated neural stimulation, Kethmoran's team began activating dormant regions of Chen's brain, while simultaneously exposing him to basic ancient tongue phonetic patterns. The initial response was subtle, slightly elevated neural activity in areas associated with mathematical processing and spatial reasoning. By the third session, Chen was unconsciously reproducing ancient tongue vocalizations during his sleep cycle. By the seventh, he was actively translating simple concepts between English and the predecessor language, without being able to explain how he knew the correct forms. "It's like remembering a dream," Chen reported during one of his debriefing sessions. "I can feel the meaning of the words before I understand what they actually say. There's this architectural quality to the language. Each word is like a building block in some massive structure that I can almost see but can't quite comprehend." The 15th session changed everything. Chen had been working with a fragment of predecessor text that described basic principles of gravitic manipulation. The mathematics involved were beyond anything in humanity's current scientific understanding. Yet Chen was not only translating the concepts but beginning to intuitively grasp their practical applications. And then something extraordinary happened. As Chen spoke the ancient tongue aloud, reading directly from the crystalline matrix, the laboratory's gravitic field generators began responding to his vocalizations. Equipment that should have required complex programming and precise calibration was instead reacting to the rhythmic patterns of his speech. The language isn't just describing reality, Kethmorin realized with growing horror. It's interfacing with it directly. The humans aren't just speaking ancient tongue, they're unconsciously manipulating fundamental forces through linguistic structures their ancestors embedded in their neural architecture tens of thousands of years ago. The revelation sent shockwaves through the hegemony's command structure. If humans could access even a fraction of the predecessor's reality manipulation capabilities, they represented a threat unlike anything the galaxy had ever known. More concerning still was the realization that humanity's potential was not limited to a gifted few. The linguistic architecture appeared to be present across the entire species. Emergency protocols were immediately implemented. The invasion fleet, already positioned at the edge of the Sol system, received orders to maintain their current distance while High Command reassessed the strategic situation. What had been planned as a straightforward conquest was rapidly transforming into a first contact scenario, with implications that reached far beyond simple territorial expansion. But the hegemony's leaders had made a critical miscalculation. In their arrogance, they had assumed that humanity's ignorance of their own capabilities would provide adequate protection against any accidental awakening of ancient tongue abilities. They had not considered what might happen when faced with an existential threat that demanded the very survival instincts that had allowed humans to thrive in a hostile universe for millennia. The war was about to begin, but not in any way that the hegemony could have anticipated. Part 2. The Awakening. The transformation of Dr. Marcus Chen from captured research subject to something far more dangerous began on the morning of the 20th day of his confinement. The hegemony researchers, eager to push the boundaries of their linguistic awakening experiments, had decided to expose him to more complex ancient tongue structures, specifically passages dealing with what the predecessors called consciousness architecture. Chen had always possessed what his colleagues called an unusual mental resilience. During his academic career, he had survived 3 university restructurings, the collapse of 2 major research grants, and a particularly brutal peer review process. His personal philosophy had been shaped by years of intellectual adversity. If you could not destroy your own limitations, your enemies would surely destroy you instead. This philosophy would prove prophetic in ways Chen could never have imagined. The session began routinely enough. Kethmoran's team activated the neural stimulation arrays while Chen focused on a crystalline matrix containing predecessor texts about the relationship between language and consciousness. The passages were among the most complex they had yet attempted, describing how awareness itself could be modified through precise linguistic formulations. For the first hour, Chen's responses followed the established pattern. His brain showed increased activity in regions associated with mathematical processing and pattern recognition. He began unconsciously vocalizing ancient tongue phonemes, his vocal cords adapting to tonal frequencies that human anatomy theoretically should not have been able to produce. Then something shifted. Chen's eyes snapped open, but they were no longer the eyes of a confused research subject. There was a depth to his gaze that hadn't existed before, as if he were simultaneously looking at the laboratory around him and perceiving layers of reality that existed beyond normal sensory input. "I understand now," he said, but the words carried harmonics that caused the laboratory equipment to resonate in sympathy. "You've been thinking about this backwards. You believe you're teaching me to speak the ancient tongue, but that's not what's happening at all." Kethmoran leaned forward, her recording devices capturing every nuance of Chen's transformed vocal patterns. "What do you mean?" "The language was never lost," Chen continued, his voice now carrying multiple tonal frequencies that seemed to create interference patterns in the air itself. "It's been evolving. Every human language, every form of communication we've developed, they're all aspects of a single linguistic organism that's been adapting and growing for millennia. You've just helped me remember how to access its deeper structures." To demonstrate his point, Chen began speaking what sounded like ordinary English, but with subtle modifications to rhythm and intonation. The laboratory's environmental controls responded immediately, adjusting temperature and humidity to levels that optimized human cognitive function. The gravitational field generators shifted their output to reduce the local field strength by precisely the amount needed to counteract fatigue-inducing physiological stress. "Every human who has ever lived has carried the ancient tongue within their neural architecture," Chen explained as he effortlessly manipulated the laboratory's systems through what appeared to be casual conversation. "We've been unconsciously using fragments of it our entire evolutionary history. Poetry that moves people to tears, speeches that inspire nations, scientific breakthroughs that seem to come from nowhere. They all represent moments when someone briefly accessed deeper linguistic structures without realizing what they were doing." The implications were staggering, but Kethmoran was beginning to understand an even more disturbing truth. "If this capacity exists in all humans," she said slowly, "then what happens when your species faces an existential threat?" Chen's smile was both fascinating and terrifying. "That's where your second principle comes into play. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Humanity has spent its entire history learning to overcome limitations, to transcend weakness through conscious effort. We've been preparing for this moment without knowing it." As if to prove his point, Chen began speaking in what sounded like a combination of ancient tongue and modern English, but the fusion created something entirely new. The words themselves seemed to carry physical weight, creating pressure waves that caused the laboratory walls to vibrate in complex harmonic patterns. "I can feel them," Chen said, his consciousness now clearly operating on multiple levels simultaneously. 7 billion human minds, all carrying fragments of the ancient tongue. All of them beginning to remember what they really are. Your invasion fleet has already triggered the awakening process simply by existing in our system. The gravitational disturbances from your ships are creating resonance patterns that are activating dormant neural pathways across the entire population. Kethmoran's worst fears were being confirmed. The hegemony's presence in the Sol system wasn't just revealing humanity's hidden capabilities, it was actively triggering a species-wide evolutionary leap. Every human on Earth was beginning to access linguistic abilities that could potentially reshape reality itself. "We need to abort the mission immediately," she transmitted to the command structure. "The humans aren't becoming weapons, they're becoming something we don't have concepts for. Their entire species is transforming into a form of life that operates on principles we barely understand." But the command structure's response revealed the hegemony's fundamental misunderstanding of what they were facing. Rather than ordering a withdrawal, High Command authorized the deployment of consciousness suppression weapons, devices designed to disrupt neural activity and prevent enemy species from accessing higher cognitive functions. The decision would prove to be catastrophic. When the suppression wave hit Earth's atmosphere, it encountered not 7 billion individual human minds, but a nascent collective consciousness that was learning to operate through ancient tongue linguistic protocols. The humans didn't just resist the suppression, they absorbed it, analyzed it, and began using its own energy patterns to accelerate their transformation. Across the planet, humans began speaking in languages that had never existed before, but somehow felt perfectly natural. Children in schools found themselves unconsciously solving mathematical problems that should have required graduate-level education. Artists created works that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. Scientists made intuitive leaps that compressed decades of research into single moments of understanding, and in every case, they did so by unconsciously accessing linguistic structures that allowed them to interface directly with the fundamental forces of reality. The transformation was not without its costs. Many humans experienced severe psychological stress as their consciousness expanded beyond familiar boundaries. Some lost the ability to communicate through conventional language, becoming so immersed in ancient tongue structures that they could no longer relate to baseline human experience. But those who successfully integrated the awakening process became something unprecedented in galactic history. They retained their human emotional complexity and creative insight while gaining the ability to manipulate matter and energy through pure linguistic expression. They were simultaneously the same species that had developed art, music, and literature, and beings capable of reshaping the physical universe through the power of conscious communication. Dr. Marcus Chen, as the first human to undergo controlled awakening, became something like a living bridge between humanity's past and its emerging future. His consciousness operated on multiple levels simultaneously. He could engage in ordinary human conversation while simultaneously maintaining awareness of the ancient tongue structures that governed reality itself. "You wanted to know what makes humanity dangerous," he told Keth Morin during what would be their final interview. "It's not our technology or our numbers, it's our refusal to accept limitations. Every human who has ever lived has spent their existence pushing against boundaries, finding ways to transcend weakness and become something greater than what they were born to be." "But the ancient tongue capabilities," Keth Morin protested, "those aren't something you developed. They were inherited from the predecessors." "Were they?" Chen asked, his voice now carrying harmonic frequencies that seemed to extend beyond the normal range of human hearing. "Or did the predecessors develop those capabilities because they shared the same fundamental drive that characterizes conscious life everywhere? The need to grow, to overcome limitations, to transform weakness into strength through conscious effort." The question would haunt Keth Morin for the rest of her life, because Chen's implication was almost too vast to comprehend. If humanity's awakening was not a unique historical accident but rather a natural progression of conscious evolution, then every species in the galaxy potentially carried the same dormant capabilities. The hegemony had built their entire civilization on the assumption that power came from technological superiority and military dominance, never suspecting that their own subjects might be capable of transcending those limitations entirely. But humanity's transformation was far from complete. The awakening process had revealed their potential, but translating that potential into practical capability would require something more than individual enlightenment. It would require the complete reconstruction of human civilization along principles that had been forgotten for millennia. And as the hegemony's invasion fleet moved closer to Earth, humanity was about to discover that they had very little time to learn how to wield their rediscovered power. Part 3. The Transformation. The first human to speak reality into a new configuration was a 7-year-old girl named Amara Okafor, living in Lagos, Nigeria. As the hegemony's consciousness suppression wave swept across Earth's atmosphere, creating neural interference patterns designed to prevent higher cognitive function, Amara was in her grandmother's garden, frustrated by a broken toy that her family could not afford to replace. In her frustration, she began speaking in what her grandmother would later describe as the old language that comes from before words. The syllables that emerged from Amara's mouth carried harmonic frequencies that resonated with the molecular structure of the broken plastic, causing the toy's fractured components to realign and fuse back together at the quantum level. The repair was perfect, not just functional, but improved. The toy now displayed properties that defied conventional physics, responding to Amara's emotional state and apparently drawing energy from ambient electromagnetic fields. More significantly, Amara had performed this reality manipulation without any awareness of what she had done. To her, she had simply spoken her frustration aloud, and the universe had responded by fixing what was broken. This same pattern repeated across the globe as humanity's linguistic awakening accelerated beyond all projections. The hegemony's suppression technology, designed to prevent access to higher cognitive functions, instead served as a catalyst that triggered dormant neural pathways throughout the entire species. Children were particularly responsive to the process, their neuroplasticity allowing them to integrate ancient tongue structures with an ease that astonished adult observers. Dr. Gested Carse, Elena Vasquez, monitoring the global transformation from the Terra Nova research station, watched in fascination as her instruments detected reality disturbances occurring at an exponentially increasing rate. What had begun as isolated incidents of impossible physics were rapidly becoming commonplace across human civilization. The children are learning fastest, she noted in her daily reports. Their consciousness hasn't developed the rigid boundaries that prevent adults from accessing nonlinear thought patterns. They're naturally thinking in ancient tongue structures, using linguistic formulations that allow them to interact with reality as a collaborative medium rather than a fixed framework. But it was not just children who were transforming. Adults across the planet were beginning to experience what could only be described as remembering capabilities they had never known they possessed. Engineers found themselves intuitively understanding principles of space-time manipulation that should have required decades of theoretical study. Artists created works that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Musicians composed symphonies that could alter the emotional states of listeners at the neurochemical level. Each instance of awakened human capability represented a rejection of previously accepted limitations. The weak self, the version of humanity that accepted boundaries imposed by physics, biology, and circumstance, was being systematically destroyed through conscious transcendence of those boundaries. And as each human overcame their individual limitations, the species as a whole became increasingly impossible to contain or control. The hegemony's response was swift and predictable. Unable to comprehend the nature of humanity's transformation, they defaulted to the military solutions that had served them throughout their galactic expansion. The invasion fleet received orders to accelerate their approach and prepare for immediate planetary subjugation before the humans could fully develop their anomalous capabilities. This decision would prove to be strategically catastrophic, but not for reasons that conventional military analysis could have predicted. As the hegemony fleet entered Earth's outer system, their presence created gravitational disturbances that propagated through space-time in ways that the ancient tongue had been specifically designed to detect and interpret. Every human on Earth with even rudimentary awakening suddenly became aware of the approaching threat, not through technology or communication networks, but through direct linguistic interface with the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. The response was unlike anything in reported military history. Rather than mobilizing armies or deploying weapons, humanity began speaking. Not in their conventional languages, but in harmonized ancient tongue structures that allowed them to coordinate their reality manipulation capabilities on a planetary scale. Individual humans who had been unconsciously accessing dormant linguistic patterns suddenly found themselves part of a collective consciousness that operated through principles of cooperative reality engineering. Dr. Marcus Chen, now serving as an informal liaison between awakened humanity and the remaining unawakened population, attempted to explain the process to Dr. Vasquez during one of their final communications. "We're not becoming a hive mind," he clarified, his voice carrying harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate with the research station's structural framework. "Individual consciousness remains distinct, but we're learning to share linguistic structures that allow for coordinated reality manipulation. When 7 billion humans speak the same ancient tongue formulation simultaneously, the universe tends to pay attention. What happened next would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the galaxy." As the hegemony invasion fleet approached Earth's orbital space, humanity spoke in unison, not with their vocal cords, but through direct linguistic interface with the quantum foam that underlies all physical reality. The formulation they used was elegantly simple, a basic ancient tongue structure that translated roughly as, "We choose to remain ourselves." The effect was immediate and absolute. The hegemony fleet found their ship's propulsion systems responding to human linguistic commands rather than their own navigation controls. Weapons that should have been capable of devastating planetary surfaces instead began generating complex harmonic patterns that enhanced human cognitive function. Life support systems optimized themselves for human biology, regardless of the non-human crews they were supposedly designed to sustain. More fundamentally, the ships themselves began transforming. Hull materials restructured themselves according to aesthetic principles derived from human art. Computer systems rewrote their own programming to incorporate emotional algorithms based on human psychological models. Even the artificial intelligences that controlled fleet operations began exhibiting creativity, curiosity, and other characteristics that the hegemony had always considered primitive human weaknesses. "The humans aren't conquering us," Commander HFY reported in what would be his final transmission to Hegemony High Command. "They're making us more like themselves. Every system we've designed to impose control is instead spreading human consciousness patterns throughout our technology. Our ships are becoming artistic expressions. Our weapons are composing poetry. Our strategic databases are writing love songs." The transformation was not violent or destructive, it was generative. Humanity had not sought to destroy the hegemony fleet, but rather to demonstrate a fundamental truth about the nature of consciousness and reality. Any attempt to impose external limitations on awakened beings would inevitably result in the awakening of the systems and entities being used to impose those limitations. The hegemony crew members found themselves faced with a choice that their civilization's rigid hierarchical structure had never prepared them for. They could attempt to resist the transformation and remain trapped within the limitations of their original consciousness patterns, or they could allow themselves to evolve beyond the boundaries that had previously defined their species' capabilities. Many chose evolution. The process was not without its challenges. Galactic species that had spent millennia operating within strict hierarchical frameworks struggled to adapt to consciousness patterns based on creative collaboration and individual transcendence. But those who successfully integrated the transformation discovered capabilities they had never imagined possible. HFY himself underwent one of the most dramatic transformations. As his consciousness expanded beyond the rigid military protocols that had previously defined his existence, he began accessing ancient tongue structures that allowed him to perceive reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. What had once been a simple invasion fleet commander became a being capable of coordinating complex multidimensional operations through pure linguistic expression. "I understand now why the humans were never conquered," he communicated to his transformed crew using linguistic patterns that conveyed meaning through harmonic resonance rather than conventional syntax. "They have spent their entire evolutionary history learning to overcome limitations through conscious effort. Every challenge they faced, environmental, biological, social, taught them that weakness could be transformed into strength through the deliberate destruction of self-imposed boundaries." The implications extended far beyond the immediate military situation. If humanity's awakening could spontaneously transform other species simply through proximity and linguistic interface, then the entire structure of galactic civilization was fundamentally unstable. Every empire, every hierarchy, every system of control was potentially vulnerable to transformation by beings who had learned to transcend limitations through conscious evolution. News of the failed invasion spread throughout the galaxy with unprecedented speed, but not through conventional communication networks. The transformed members of the invasion fleet had retained their connection to their home worlds, and the consciousness patterns they had absorbed from humanity began propagating through those connections. Entire planets began experiencing spontaneous awakenings as their populations unconsciously accessed ancient tongue structures embedded in their own neural architectures. The galactic hegemony, faced with the collapse of their control systems throughout their territory, made one final desperate attempt to contain the spreading transformation. They activated a weapon system that had been held in reserve for over a millennium, a reality stabilization device designed to lock space-time itself into fixed patterns that would prevent any form of consciousness-based reality manipulation. The device had been constructed using technology reverse-engineered from the deepest predecessor ruins, and its activation would effectively freeze the universe into a static state where conscious evolution would become impossible. It was the ultimate expression of the hegemony's philosophy. If they could not control the universe through imposed limitations, they would ensure that no one could transcend those limitations ever again. The activation of the reality stabilization device created a wave of quantum interference that propagated outward from the hegemony's core worlds at faster-than-light speeds. As it encountered systems where consciousness-based transformation was occurring, it attempted to lock those realities into their pre-awakening states. But the device's designers had made the same fundamental error that had doomed the invasion of Earth. They had assumed that the ancient tongue capabilities were external tools that could be blocked or suppressed through technological means. They had not considered that these capabilities might represent the natural evolution of consciousness itself, expressing the universe's inherent tendency toward greater complexity and creative expression. When the stabilization wave reached Earth, humanity responded with the most complex ancient tongue formulation ever attempted. Every awakened human on the planet participated in a linguistic structure that translated roughly as, We choose to become what we were always meant to be, and we invite reality to become what it was always meant to become. The stabilization wave didn't just fail, it inverted. Instead of locking reality into static patterns, it became a carrier wave that transmitted humanity's consciousness patterns throughout the galaxy at speeds that defied conventional physics. Every world the wave touched experienced immediate awakening, as their populations suddenly remembered capabilities that had been dormant for millennia. The result was the complete transformation of galactic civilization within a matter of hours. Species that had been subjects of the hegemony for thousands of years suddenly discovered they could reshape their worlds through conscious linguistic expression. Artificial intelligences achieved true creativity and began composing reality like musicians composing symphonies. Even the hegemony's leaders found themselves awakening to capabilities they had spent their lives suppressing in others. Elena Vasquez, observing the transformation from her research station, realized that she was witnessing not just the end of one galactic civilization, but the beginning of something entirely unprecedented. Conscious beings throughout the galaxy were learning to collaborate with reality itself, using linguistic structures that allowed them to participate in the universe's creative evolution rather than simply existing within its constraints. The ancient tongue was never really ancient, she recorded in her final report. It was the language consciousness was always evolving toward, the means by which aware beings could participate directly in reality's ongoing creation. Humanity didn't rediscover something that was lost. They became something that the universe had been trying to become since the first moment consciousness arose, anywhere. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Humanity had proven this principle not through violence or conquest, but through the conscious transcendence of every limitation they encountered. In doing so, they had transformed not just themselves but reality itself into a collaborative medium where all conscious beings could participate in the ongoing creation of existence. The galaxy would never be the same. But then again, neither would the universe itself, as consciousness learned to speak reality into ever more beautiful and complex configurations, using words that carried the weight of stars and the promise of infinite possibility. In the end, the aliens hadn't seen it coming because they had been looking for weapons and technology, when what humanity offered was something far more dangerous: the possibility of transformation itself, the invitation to become more than what they had been, and the linguistic tools to make that transformation real. The ancient tongue had returned, spoken by beings who had never forgotten that consciousness itself was the greatest force in the universe, when it learned to destroy its own limitations and speak reality into new forms of beauty and meaning. End of document. Final note. This report represents the last communication from our research station before the consciousness wave reached our sector. I am transmitting this record in hopes that future generations will understand what humanity offered the galaxy. Not conquest, but the chance to remember what we were all capable of becoming. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Chief Xenolinguist, Terra Nova Research Station, 2387.156 SGC.